Tomorrow is the first day of spring. Firstly, I do want to welcome everybody, but I also need to let you know that we are recording this session today, and that's so that for everyone who registered, we send them a link so that they can still see the presentation from today. And also it's a wonderful opportunity to share within your own teams, within your centres, and we'll be sending that out to everyone tomorrow. Today, I would also like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. And I'm coming to you from Trentham up in central regional Victoria, and that's on Dja Djurrung peoples that are the traditional owners of the land here. So wherever you're dialing in from today, please take a moment to recognise the land on which you meet today. Now, shortly, I'll be introducing you to Mary Jeavons, who's our special guest speaker for today. You're in for a treat, as usual. But first, some very quick housekeeping. Welcome to Microsoft Teams. We're all pretty good at it now, although I seem to still be in the remedial class, I think, sometimes. But many of you will know the platform better than we do. But for those that don't, just to flag some important items before we get started, we have muted everybody as it does make it easier so that there's no feedback within the system. And we do want you to ask some questions though. Up on the top of your menu bar, you'll see a little chat bubble. It's like that chat icon at the top of your screen. So please ask any questions in the chat, and I'll actually be putting those to Mary at the end of her session, because it is important that if you've got something you'd like to ask, that you have that opportunity. So now, what you've all come for today. I'm really delighted to introduce you to Mary Jeavons, who's the founding director of Jeavons Landscaping. Mary is a landscape architect with more than 30 years experience of planning, designing, and an incredible advocate for outdoor play spaces in all types of settings. Early childhood settings, schools, public parks, play spaces, and therapeutic spaces. Mary is experienced in strategic planning for open space, parks and play areas for local governments and developers Australia-wide. She also represents Play Australia on the Australian Standards Committee on Playground Safety and has a particular interest in access and inclusion. So it really is such a pleasure to introduce you to Mary today. And thank you, Mary. And I very gladly hand it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me okay?
I certainly can.
Good, thanks. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I stand today. And I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri clan of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. And today I want to talk to you about nature play in early childhood centres. And I know that you probably come for a very wide range of places today, and we all have different names for services for the early years. So I've lumped them all together and just called them early childhood centres. So I hope that suits your particular services. I'm just trying to progress. There we go. So today I want to explore the connections between children and nature and just look at different aspects of nature play, what it is, and I'll just brush. I don't want to be rude, but I do want to just brush on what it isn't as well. And I guess the general purpose of the talk today is how early years centres can provide nature play within whatever constraints you have in your outdoor environment. So I guess there's a question of why do we bother anyway? Why do children need to connect with nature generally? And I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's available online. I should have put the link in, but it's a publication which is a joint one between Beyond Blue and Deakin University, and it's called Beyond Blue to Green. It's a very clever name, I think, and it's talking about the benefits of contact with nature for people of all kinds, but it does specifically mention children for their mental health and well-being. So that does give us... Sorry, got a bit of interference.
Yeah, sorry,
there.
Mary. I'll just fix that. If you're there and you've got your mic on, if you could actually turn your mic off, thank you.
Thanks. Yes, I suddenly thought, what am I saying here? Okay, so natural settings have been associated via research with strong developmental benefits. And I keep saying this, but for all humans, but obviously for children, and to improve children's behaviour and learning, to reduce negative behaviours, and to facilitate self-esteem, autonomy and independence. And that's only the beginning of it. Why else do we really want to foster nature play? And there's some really important reasons, I think. One of the big ones, I think, is to give children a sense of connectedness to the place where they come from and to their local natural environment. And if you're sitting indoors, basically on a screen all day, you really do not have the observations of a detailed, your natural setting and where you belong. There's also a really important, and clearly with climate change and all the other environmental issues that we face today, there's this major issue with stewardship. And I think there's been quite a lot of research, and the zoos are particularly valuable in this regard, in uncovering the fact that if people, children, don't feel comfortable, feel familiar and know something about an animal or an environment, they're not going to care enough about it to protect it in the future. And heaven knows we're going to need lots of protective custodians of our environment for the future, as we all know. There's also, I think, a sort of growing dissatisfaction with the limitations of a lot of products on the market and ways that in the past some playgrounds have been designed, and people just sort of express a dissatisfaction that they're plastic and steel and they just don't reflect any natural processes or materials at all. There's a big aesthetic preference, I think. And there's also thinking about the ideas of sustainability and the whole of life costs of materials that we use in all of our settings. So those are some, but I think probably from our education perspective and the whole children's development, that I think the one that I would really like to focus on is that there's such strong theories of learning and pedagogy which link natural play environments to really high quality learning opportunities through play. And basically a lot of natural materials and settings offer children a whole lot of really important play advantages. First of all, one of these is that they are inherently open-ended. So if something has never been given a purpose, children are very much able then to decide what their own purpose for it is. They meaning natural settings, and especially specifically plant materials, can be a continuous source of loose materials and are therefore highly manipulable and adaptable for children's own purposes, which is one of the inherent aspects of play that we really value. They're highly adaptable for purposes of teaching and learning. Children can find stuff and they can be sorted, counted, identified, observed. You can use natural materials in art, in numeracy, in literacy, and quite importantly, in imaginative play. And I think that because, again, natural products, materials, objects have not got an inherent purpose that's been given them, children have a lot of autonomy in choosing how they want to use stuff. And also they have to often make their own decisions. You know, if, say, they're climbing on a tree, they have to decide whether or not the branches are spaced adequately that they can reach them, or are they brave enough to take that next step? Is that branch strong enough to trust their weight? So children for once, given the opportunity to make their own decisions. And of course, sometimes they'll fail, but that's a learning experience as well. It's our job just to make sure they don't fail too badly. And of course, a really important thing is that natural settings have a virtually endless source of sensory stimuli for children. And again, that whole thing about trust and confidence in children's judgment. And I'll say this, I'll probably mention it again later, but it's a really interesting thing that's happening because so many of our children in Victoria, at least, are going to bush kindergartens these days, and they learn to be extremely competent at doing stuff in the bush, making their own decisions, playing with sticks, building stuff. And then they go to school, and we're finding that schools and the kids in the first year of primary school have been doing things that even grade sixes are not allowed to do at school. So it's really interesting how nature builds a lot of competence in children, and we as adults need to trust that competence. The other thing, which is part of just that whole thing about being a place and familiarity with place and seasons, is nature is inherently unpredictable, and then there's seasonal variations. There's the beauty of seasonal change, flowering times, etc. And we need to be very tuned into those. I mean, as Karen said, it's the first day of spring tomorrow, but that's really just our Western view of spring. You know, I know that our Wurundjeri people in Melbourne have at least 6 seasons, and there's 7 or 8, depending on whether it's floods or drought as well. So tuning into those much more subtle seasonal variations is something which only nature can give us. And then there is this aspect of physical challenge and movement, that there's a lot of stuff you can do just using natural elements. So I think you could sum these up as saying education at its most compelling. So what are we talking about when we're talking about nature play? And I have a few sort of things which I consider that are quite essential. And look, it's clear that it's a bit of a grey area if all of these aspects need to be present, but I think some really do. So obviously there's a bit of a spectrum from nature to extremely man-made, but some of the things which I think are really important. In the first one is that it actually is out of doors, and that it's actually outside. So if it's kind of fake outdoors but indoors, to me that doesn't quite cut it. I would say that nature play requires predominantly natural materials, and these could be durable timber, logs, rocks, stone, trees, grass, other plant materials, and of course the terrain, the landform, paths, all sorts of components of a space can be made of nature, natural materials. I believe that they should also include living things, and to me that's a pretty essential ingredient of a nature space. And I do like this idea of spaces being pretty open-ended and therefore adaptable for children's purposes, and allowing that children's decision-making. And I actually think this is an overlap which probably needs to overlap all of these things. And I do think that a true nature play space needs to have something children can actually manipulate themselves. They need to have some loose, manipulable materials with which children can actually engage. So it might be something that's made of a nice timber or something, but if it's just really completely fixed and there's nothing you can change about it, I'm not sure that that also entirely cuts the mustard. And of course, with that engaging, manipulable supply of loose materials, of course, it's really useful if we choose plants that have a really good supply of those things, because they're inherently excellent play materials. And I think obviously this is sort of not really part of a definition, but we need to think about where children do spend time, and it needs to be accessible and available. And it can be very small scale. We don't have to recreate a giant national park to have a really successful nature experience. It can be very small scale, and basically where children actually are. So I suppose I'd also like to, by definition, say what I don't think nature play is. And that picture that I'm just showing now, I think I'd say I would not, even though the thing in the middle in that pretty unappealing space is actually sand, and that's obviously a natural material, but I think, and the odd pot plant isn't really enough. I think that spaces that are fully indoors are not nature play. I think any space that's completely lacking in loose materials, especially loose natural materials, where there's an absence of living things and plants, where all the materials and surfaces are predominantly man-made. And also, I suppose this is the one that really gets me, is where you have fake nature. So fake logs made of concrete or steel, fake things that look like leaves sticking out of a steel post, and that's your nature play structure. I don't want to engage in any litigation, so I haven't used any photos of products off catalogues, but there's plenty of them around. I'm sure you've seen them all. And of course, things where children have no way of inputting any decision making, and you know, things where all the decision making's been sort of made, and where there's no chance encounters, seasonal change. So it's really the corollary of all the things I said nature play is, I guess. And you know, there's a lot of plasticky stuff. And look, I think what I also need to say is that there's nothing wrong with certain materials which have inherently good properties, like steel, plastics, all have their place, I think. But it's just that we just don't want any space where children have to spend the most important years of their life to be lacking in nature play. And here's another example of a space where I think you could argue nature is not exactly dominant. And, you know, it does raise a few questions, like I'm allowed to criticize, or it's not a criticism, I'm allowed to comment on this one because it's one of our own, but it's a fully indoor space. We've used fake grass, we've used real plants, we've used real logs. So I guess, as I say, there's a spectrum of nature and you do what you can, but you don't pretend that this is, like, you know, you wouldn't want that to be the only experience of nature that those children will ever have in their lives or in their day. So if I was running a children's centre and they're very restrained in the actual available space, I'd probably try and make sure there were other opportunities to take them elsewhere, to a nearby park or whatever's practical. You do what you can. So I guess what a large part of this talk today, I want to talk about design elements and how we can actually use them in our outdoor play settings, having discovered what they are. And there's a whole lot of things. So I mentioned the need to connect children with living things and their place, where they come from. And those flannel flowers are actually a thing of my own childhood bush growing up, and they're very strong sort of memory. But like all of these things connect children to their environment and particular trees, particular flowering, fruiting aspects of vegetation and so on. And there's also not just connecting them to the plants and so on, but also connecting them to living things, generally animals and birds specifically, and anything we do in terms of planting is, if it's good planting, may attract birds if they're brave enough to move into a children's centre, but also looking after animals. It's another really valuable thing for children to, and a lot of centres do have chickens. Sometimes there might be a dog. I've seen schools with dogs, rabbits, all sorts of other creatures. So understanding that animals are part of nature, another really important thing, and earthworms, and getting over any aversions that children have to things they think might be yucky. So thinking then about how we use and why we use natural materials, another valuable thing I think is that we can define useful spaces in our centres by using especially planting, and you can see all sorts of different planting in these images. And plants can define spaces that children will use then for different purposes. And you can see pretty scruffy kind of planting on the left with sort of that defines little narrow spaces, very light, that you can still see through. Big grand trees that might define a really sort of magical space, or what's technically a noxious weed in Melbourne, the old mirror bush, but honestly, they're so tough, children can't destroy them. Sometimes they have their merits, but they're very good at defining little cubby spaces and loose things. And plants that sort of weep down and give you that spatial enclosure, and they're still possible to be able to be supervised. And, you know, you can use big clumps of plants, built structures, little runways. So vegetation and natural materials can be really useful for that defining. And in early years centres, of course, we have to clearly be careful about supervision and make sure that educators can see the children, of course. Another aspect of design is, of course, just what things are made of, obviously. So just using timber, there's people, humans, from my observation, seem to have a pretty strong preference for timber, and it's a very pleasing, warm material, warm in cold weather, but it doesn't get as hot as some materials do in hot weather, and it's got lots of advantages. And there's heaps of other natural materials that we can use: logs, rocks and stone, water, sand, mulch, pebbles, sticks, all those things. And the reason I put that picture down the bottom there with the mulch on the little shop counter, it's actually not an early years centre, it's a public playground actually, but we've used like those little nooks and crannies underneath, which are perfectly applicable to early years centres. But the beauty, a lot of people are going for either synthetic grass or rubber surfaces, and one of the reasons I don't love those materials is because you can't play with them. And one of the beauties of mulch is that you can actually use it as the currency for play. So to me, that's an advantage too. Sort of all sorts of ways you can use timber, of course, in decking, in barriers, as log posts, as sawn posts, using rocks and so on. And they just give that slightly softer look than if everything is a man-made material. And of course, using materials like stone slices through, these are on the right, slices through bluestone boulders to define little narrow runways and paths through vegetation. Each one of those might have the little bubbles, the little vesicles in it from the volcanic stone. So they often have a lot of quite inherently attractive details. And of course, logs and rocks again, in conjunction with other materials. And of course, water is nothing, you know, more pleasing than playing with water if you can afford to provide it and maintain it. So another thing about natural materials is the sensory qualities, and of course the external senses like taste, touch, smell. A lot of plant materials have fantastically engaging sort of furriness or prickliness or all sorts of things which children find appealing, and also herbs, culinary herbs, pebbles, all sorts of things like that. So having that sensory variety in our spaces is it's really interesting for children, and they you can use it in a slightly therapeutic way if that's your particular centre needs to do that. You know, sometimes children have a bit of an aversion to certain things, so it might be a way of getting them familiar with certain touch senses. So there's all sorts of deeper ways you can use some of these sensory materials. Obviously, just colour and funny looking plants and so on are part of that, the visual senses. And these little beads, which are a part of a barrier that we used once in a special schools, they've got little sound, so using different materials for sound as well as for things that are nice to touch and fiddle with and move around and manipulate. And also light, using the beauty of natural light and seeing the sun move around, and children get the sense that the sun is actually something where, you know, the light moves in the sky and you get the reflections and so on. And of course, some other sensory qualities in paving materials and so on. There's endless ways, and look, they're not cheap either, I will warn you, but they do create a lot of real appeal, and especially for some children who really like to explore these sensory qualities. So now I wanted to just talk about this whole issue of looseness. And this is where I think natural materials really shine. And they shine in particular when used in conjunction with static stuff, because they can really make static cubbies or other structures much more usable for play. It adds that level of complexity. So obviously the sand and the pebbles and the combination thereof, great play materials. And look, it's not just children who like fiddling around with rocks. I watched one summer up at Bright and watched these grown-ups spend hours in the river up there manipulating rocks and fiddling around. So play doesn't have to be restricted to young kids. So all these materials can be used. I lump all this loose, creative, sensory play. I'm sorry for the specialists amongst you, but it's very hard to sieve it out because they're all used for so many different purposes, that creative, sensory, imaginative, role play, and so on. So I'm really talking about the materials here, but the sand, the digging, the dirt, water, loose materials, plants, building blocks, branches, twigs, art materials. And look, we have to think, I will talk about planting a bit later, but there are already issues that I imagine you're thinking about for your centre of how do we get enough deep soil, especially if you've got a centre that's using a podium or a rooftop for your playground. Getting enough deep soil for plants to even survive is a really big problem. Having enough depth for sand, same, we need about 450 millimetres plus drainage. How do you contain loose stuff and stop it spreading all over the space? And how do you protect it from being, plants from being trashed with children running around? Making sure that the complexity of a space is enhanced by these things and trying to keep up that constant change. So there are issues. I'll talk about some of these as we go. And look, mess and fear is one of them. This is actually in a school, but same idea, using loose twigs and branches and stuff for building. Adults are terrified of children taking control of these sorts of materials, but it's actually really valuable. Sand is one of our kind of basics, I suppose you'd say, in an early childhood centre. And I will just say, and I'm allowed to criticise this picture too, because it's another one of mine, but we usually try and avoid having loose materials mixed up. So having mulch right next to sand can be an invitation for them to all get mixed up into a giant mess. And sand, they're both expensive materials, so often I would have them divided by a path, but as it happens, it's happened this way. And so it is a bit of a management issue sometimes for staff, but having, there's a variety of edges that you can use for sand play areas. I particularly like beached edges actually, so that the sand is below the top of the path. And I do like having a path as a sort of management edge. And you can see the pebbles are a bit of a nice sensory detail, but more importantly, you can sweep the sand back into the sand pit and it won't spill out. And of course, a beached edge can be really useful for children with a physical disability, and it's a bit easier, depending on their disability, to get in if they don't have to clamber up and over a big edge. And there's all sorts of other solutions that you can use to help children with various mobility aids and physical disabilities to play in sand, with sand, adjacent to sand. And it's really about trying to manage, particularly trying to manage the spillage of that sand and get it back into the sand pit and not all over your paths and your fake grass and your carpets. So many loose things that are valuable for play. So of course, leaves is a beautiful one, flowers, endless. And look, don't plant one plant that has one flower per year and then be sad when the children pick it. Be practical and realistic. Tough stuff that produces flowers all the time, good old daisy bushes and so on. Doesn't matter if they pick them and pick them and pick them. In fact, it might encourage them to keep flowering. But these will be used in all sorts of potions and little sushi rolls and whatever the imaginative play that's going on at the time. And I've really uncovered some quite fascinating cognitive uses in, this is actually in a school, but these kids had a massive exchange rate for gum nuts versus acorns and pebbles and onion weed and so on. So there's a lot of, it's not just about the creative sensory, there's a lot of brain power going into using these materials and creating games that are their special games that they do in those places. Dirt's something that a lot of us are a bit afraid of, and I think we have to not be afraid. It's another really valued and valuable loose material. It's really different, I think, from sand play. And again, you want to make sure that it's separated in your space. If you've got a big enough space to have your sand, your mulch and your dirt, your digging patch, preferably physically separated so they don't all end up in a big giant mess. And look, they're loose, they're unfinished. To a lot of adult eye, they're very ugly spaces, and a lot of parents really react to that. And we have to be really smart about this, because these are incredibly rich play settings, but they look really awful. So we have to educate. It's really important to educate parents about how valuable this sort of play is, and that, you know, maybe be smart if you think it's in a, well, first of all, don't let children wear their pretty dresses to kindergarten, or if they do, make sure they get changed before they play in this. I'll show you an even worse picture in a minute. This one, a lot of people are absolutely horrified when they see this picture, but when you are like listening to what these children were, just, you know, their communication with each other, the richness and depth of the play that was going on in this setting, you just can't but love it. But some people are terrified of it. So it's a matter of education and maybe a bit of gentle screening so it doesn't offend people who may choose then not to look at it. Another useful thing we can use natural materials for is for setting up spaces where pretend play, role play, etc. can take place. And there's a bit of a spectrum here I'll show you, which, you know, this is made of natural materials, but it's essentially a very static, well, it's actually a climbing structure, but with little pretend place sort of nooks and crannies underneath it. And then you've got sort of a slightly more defined by vegetations, but still essentially a structure. It's not built by the children or so on, but it's still got a very strong natural character. And then you've got all sorts of other little cubbies and settings where that pretend play can take place. And you can see there's sort of a little bit more loose surroundings, sand, vegetation, and so on. And the one on the right's got a grapevine growing over it instead of a roof, so it's pretty changeable with the seasons, of course. And then there's sort of the slightly more looser end of what you might call a structure, like it's a enclosed space, but it's got these notched posts where you can hook different stuff between them and drape them and change them over time. And there's all sorts of different play that can take place in those. And you can use planting, like really nothing much defined, but that intimate scale space is where a lot of that play will take place. And then there's the sort of much looser, wilder, unbuilt by adults, maybe just a suggestion of a frame, and the kind of complete child built. And sometimes, you know, there's this funny thing, this, you know, that word affordances, that children perceive a connection between things, and it gives them cues for their play behaviour. And so having the proximity of, say, a play structure next to something else, and that might stimulate all sorts of dramatic play. You just have to add some props, and then the play's even more complex. So your fireman's hats, your loose things, all that kind of, so where you put things can also really make that play much richer. And there could be just some little open-ended elements that might be next to a bigger structure, you know, a little log throne, or a little, like that stone bench under that structure has got just this little dip in it, like a little bowl, essentially. and it's completely open-ended, so kids fill it up with whatever they like, mulch, sand, fill up their chip packets and fill it up with water. So having that combination of fixed and loose enhances both typically. And look, this is not an early years centre, but it just explains the idea of you might have a cubby space and a slightly more open-ended space, and then the loose stuff, which comes essentially from the trees. So you've got your little Banksia fruits, and the kids were making little sushi rolls. That's after MasterChef hit some years ago. And you can see they're using those loose things in the fixed setting that's been just made of built materials. Nature, natural materials, vegetation can be used also to encourage a bit of exploration. I really like this idea of exploring, subtle, doesn't have to be huge, but just little places that look a bit rough and invite children to explore sort of complex spaces. Another thing we haven't really talked about yet is about the physical sort of literacy, the balance, the climbing, and this leads to kids developing quite important skills, and even more important these days as our children seem to get less and less fit, self-reliance, judgment, and learn to take on challenges. So having things where they have to really make their own decisions. Is this a suitable thing for my scale? And you can see already different scales of children. What's challenging to one is not particularly challenging to another. And this, when they get much bigger, then they're ready to take on making their own decisions again out in the real world. And, if you're lucky enough to have beautiful natural trees, that's great. If not, there are plenty of logs that we can use. And of course, this is quite an interesting question, really, I think, about an essentially very static structure, but materials that are quite rustic. And again, children really have to make a few decisions what they're ready to take on here. So you can use natural materials to build in a bit of challenge in physical climbing. And of course, we don't have to get all our climbing and challenge from fixed structures. You can build them into the landscape too, of course, with edges and terrain and walls and stuff. So there's, it's sort of straying a bit outside the topic of nature per se, but 2 out of those 3 are actually, you could call them natural. So I want to just also talk about trees and planting briefly. And to me, they're really a most critical part of making outdoor play spaces interesting for all sorts of reasons. And we use them to divide spaces, you can use them to separate activities and spaces. They obviously, as I've banged on about quite a bit already, provide a lot of these sensory and loose play materials. Their trees are proven to be extremely important in environmental cooling, way better than just having a shade sail. So a big tree, like, you could buy a huge tree for, if you spent $1,000 or $2,000 on a humongous advanced tree, it's a lot cheaper than a shade sail. Okay, it's not going to be quite as predictable as a shade sail, but what a fabulous asset if you've got the space. And of course, there's just this inherent amenity of plant materials. And you can see how even fake grass can be enhanced by living plants around it. So there are plenty of circumstances where you're kind of stuck with synthetic grass. This likelihood of living turf surviving can be quite slim in a very heavily used space. So it's not the end of the world. Just balance it with lots more living stuff if you can. And this is a centre where there's quite a lot of, you can see big trees, grasses, all sorts of different elements. So thinking about trees, you have to really plan for them. And I mentioned earlier the need to have sufficient soil depth. Trees is really a conversation about soil, actually, and of course drainage and needing adequate space for their root growth. And these days, with so many children's centres happening up on podiums, wind is a really big problem. And, the renders will show lots of big vegetation on the balcony, but in reality getting it to survive is not all that easy. And I'll just tell you a bit of a sad tale about that. Is we designed this children's centre years ago, and the architects had persuaded the client that there was going to be a huge tree up on the rooftop, and this was the size of the tree that actually eventuated for many practical and pragmatic reasons, and everyone was a little bit shocked. So we have to be kind of realistic about what is possible, especially on rooftops and podiums, because the management of trees is quite a tricky business. But there's so many different, just using plants for all those qualities. I talked about pickable flowers, dividing spaces, all those nice sensory qualities of, you know, touch and smell and all the rest of it. And keep in mind that planting is really vulnerable. So it's very sad when you see people put plants in places and then get surprised when children have trashed them the next day. Often they need some sort of barrier to sort of create that initial island. And once they get established, they may survive. So they're quite, you know, you can see there against that wall, that's a bit of a kernel of protection for those plants there. And you can see they've got those movable pots are actually a clever idea of just being, but they're heavy, of course, but ways of dividing off spaces. And you can see here you can use plants to create little subspaces within your centre so that, you know, it's not just a big expanse of one big activity area. And of course, veggie gardens are really valued, food production, having your compost bins and your worm farms and children learning about food production, and then ideally cooking with it if you can in your kitchen. And they're just gorgeous parts of a whole. And you can see, you know, obviously you can double up that a space that can be used to divide a space can also be growing your broad beans and giving children opportunity to dig. So these are very multi-purpose opportunities, really. So just by way of summary, I think if we have quality natural spaces, they do allow children to create their own social spaces, invent their own games, adapt materials, explore their senses, develop their social and communication skills, take a bit of risk and develop their skills in that end of the challenge department. And we hope generally learn to be independent and competent adults, and preferably all of the above. But just a couple of reminders, and I think this is really important. There's a few critical factors that absolutely make or break outdoor spaces. And these, once the space is designed, is planned and the land is purchased and the building is built, they're going to be there for the duration, really. And these all make a huge difference to how you get natural living things into your space. And I would have to say, number one, the amount of space per child. And it's very difficult to have a quality living nature space with 7 metres per child in a big, busy children's centre. It's pretty tough. The other thing is not just the amount of space per child, but how it's organised, because you can have your 7 metres per child, but it might be distributed in a narrow strip right around the building, which could be 7 metres wide. And I can tell you that is patently not enough to have any kind of activity zone plus planting. It just won't work. So really have to think, any of us who are part of the whole planning, providing, designing new centres, this is really important, how we organise our outdoor space. And of course, then the qualities of those outdoor spaces. So what are we afraid of? Why aren't we doing it? Well, one of them is the cost of real estate, of course. And that's something most of us haven't got much say in. But there is this thing that we need to think about, just that adults need to recognise that playing in nature is play, and that it's okay, and that it is actually high quality. We have to think about our perceptions of mess and dirt, and this is us as educators. and our own comfort zones. If we didn't grow up playing outdoors, are we worried there might be an ant or a spider somewhere, or that something's dirty? And we have to educate parents that these are really inherently important, valuable spaces too. There's also just this matter of time. It takes quite a lot of time. Kids who start the bush kinder programs, it might take them 6 weeks to be comfortable in the bush with no props, essentially. We have to learn to manage loose stuff and not let it just be everywhere and be a giant mess. There's all sorts of perceptions about safety, which may or may not be founded. That really, you have to be careful and sensible, of course. And there's, of course, fear of things that might possibly bite you or sting you. And they might, but maybe they have benefits as well. And of course, we need to think about the cost of maintenance, that some materials will deteriorate. Be smart about them. Have to think about compaction of soil, because as I mentioned before, that's what will kill vegetation. Managing our spaces for the benefits as well as the risks. And just really thinking about being genuinely child friendly. And if you've already got some quality nature space, just leave it alone. Don't try and fix it. So final question, I did mention this earlier, I hinted at it, is we need to actually be starting to educate school educators now, because when our bush kinder kids who are extremely competent and have learned to handle all these challenges go off to school, I'm not convinced that schools are handling it that well. So there's a thought for you for today. So I think I'm done now. So happy to answer any questions via you, Karen. Thank you.
That was just wonderful, Mary. And I was very fortunate many moons ago now, Mary, that I got to work with you on a playground that was as part of the lemon tree on a third story. And what you brought to that space was just what it could have been, and what it was just so much the better because of your influence of bringing nature into a space that we just couldn't see it. And it took your passion and expertise to bring it to that space. And when you were talking about, it always comes down to dollars, unfortunately. Not always, but a fair amount of the time it comes down to dollars, doesn't it? But I think it's how we think creatively, which you brought that creativity to us. But we do have a couple of questions. Nicole has said, what mulch would you recommend in a childcare setting that's birth to 5 years?
Well, there are mulches that, they're basically our standards, our playground. I didn't mention playground safety standards. That's a whole different conversation, but I'll just sidetrack to answer that question, Karen, by saying that, by the way, our standard has a forward, which is actually very keen on nature play. So nature play is not ruled out by our safety standards by any means. So don't think, oh, you can't do it, it's dangerous. But on the subject of mulch, our playground safety standards have a whole section on impact attenuating surfaces. So basically you need to comply with those, which is about, like, you can't just use your tree prunings. Personally, I don't particularly like bark. In Victoria, there's sort of a few typical options, but one is bark, pine bark, which I don't love because it breaks down into very dusty stuff actually quite quickly. I prefer shredded timber, and it knits together reasonably well. It's not too sharp, but you can't use your tree prunings or those awful shredded up timber waste like laminate, like old plywood and stuff. They're real no-no. And look, you just have to be very smart about babies. Like, if babies are sharing the same space, everyone, of course, complains that they'll put it in their mouths and stick it up their noses and stuff, which they probably will. So I guess I would also say, don't use mulch everywhere. Like, you only need it, well, for two reasons. One would be a garden mulch for your garden beds, which doesn't have to be playground impact attenuating mulch. But you need paths and you need other surfaces and places to go and stuff, which the only reason to use mulch is under your climbing equipment to be impact attenuating. So don't just cover your whole space with mulch. Think about other surfaces that will contribute to all the different sensory qualities the babies particularly will want, and then make sure that the mulch is contained and stuff. But yeah, I would think about that knitted, sounds like it's a knitted product, shredded pine is personally my favourite as a type of mulch. Does that answer your question? If not, type in the chat and we'll continue.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good answer to me, Mary. Yes, thank you, is the answer from Nicole. I also wanted to let everyone know that we've linked in, I found the link for the Beyond Blue to Green from Deakin University. So we've put that in the chat and I'll also send it out in the email tomorrow. We do have another question and it is about from Danielle, who says, what plant trees would work well in a high shaded area?
Well, I don't know where you come from, Daniel, so it depends whether you're in the tropics of the Daintree or down in Tasmania. So my usual answer is, as Barbara can testify, would be it depends. But look, there are plenty of websites like,
yes.
Sorry?
Queensland. We
Queensland,
have Sunshine Coast.
Okay. Well, up there you have the benefit of some gorgeous trees. I would just say go onto a local good quality advanced tree specialist website, and there's a couple down here in Melbourne. One's called Specialty Trees, another one's called Metro Trees, but there's quite a few of them, and they've got these great plant finder website databases where they'll say, I want flowering 4 meters high, evergreen and bird attracting or something. You can set up all the criteria and it'll churn out some suitable plants. But with children's centres, having banged on all this time about them dropping usable loose play materials, just be a bit careful what those things are that they're dropping, and that they're not either toxic or in a baby's yard that they're going to choke on them or stick them up their noses, or that they've got that like itchy powder stuff in them, or you do have to, there are also websites that tell you about toxic plants that are not suitable for children's centres. So it's worth just doing a bit of homework. But personally, I really love trees that have a umbrella. That's another thing you can put in your search thing, is what shape tree you want. You know, it might be you want screening trees that are like pencil pines all along a fence, or you might want a lovely umbrella shaped tree. You can also search for form in these websites, and think about what's the tree really for. Is it just for shade and cooling, or is it for climbing? In which case you might want a nice low branching structure, and talk it over with a tree supplier. Trees, everyone thinks, ooh, spending a few $100s on a tree, so worth it. And those tree people will give you really good advice. So, and you've got to really think about your drainage and your soil type. Sorry, I could go on all day about it, but
my search would have to include one I can't kill.
Well, there is a kind of toughness and durability and drought tolerance, and
yes,
there are things that plants that tolerate heavy soil, sandy soil, inundation, heat, wind. Like if you go for any plant that's got canariensis after its name, it will be good at surviving wind, because the Canary Islands are extremely windy places. So there's all sorts of clues in the plant name that will help you. But just get some advice from I'm not even a qualified horticulturalist, but there are such people about.
And I think you would have a much greater knowledge than many or most of us, Mary. I think too, we're so fortunate to have someone with your experience and knowledge, from those years of doing this type of work. But it does come from a passion. Yeah. Oh, well, absolutely. We learn from our failures as well. But it's
Plenty of them.
as an early learning centre, early childhood centre, you know, it's where do we go for advice? I mean, yes, we can come to you, Mary, as a business as well, but you know, where is that advice and that design, you know, to build creating these types of play spaces? And I mean, as you mentioned, nature doesn't have to be expensive either. It can be quite inexpensive. And when you talked about the shade sale or spending the money on a tree, I know what I'd rather spend the money on for children's enjoyment and that what nature brings to a centre. But you know, with limited budgets, how do we find someone to support these types of nature play spaces?
Look, it's a really good question, and it depends if you're just talking about a little, like I have to spruik my own profession, and landscape architects are quite good sources of advice, but of course you'll have to pay them for the pleasure. But you sort of say, well, how much is the cost of planning versus how much is the cost of not planning? So, you know, you might even just get an inexpensive concept plan, a sort of layout plan that might just show all the different areas, and then you might develop the corners and the bits of it yourselves. But you could then say, well, we've got this high level plan for our space, and we know that in this corner we want X or Y, and then maybe go to your local nursery or go to I must say, Dr. Google is always quite a good source, but just be careful. There's some absolute whackers on the internet as well. So be clever about whose advice you believe and make sure it's relevant. It's very hard to know. This is such a big question.
Yeah, that's right. And as you say, you know, it's better to pay for that planning and that expertise through you know, through the landscape.
I may be
Landscape.
somewhat biased, but of course it
Yeah,
is.
yeah, of course.
Yeah. And
Mary,
look, I wouldn't even say our whole profession is always knowledgeable about early childhood either. So be careful. And people vary in their knowledge. Of course, there's a different class, like they're landscape architects, some of whom, if you want sort of horticultural advice, of course, there are also people who are not landscape architects, but who are horticulturalists, and they will be very good at the planting, better than I would be and better than a landscape architect, unless they're also horticulturalists. And they might also focus a bit on the soil too. So a garden designer, that like depends where you are and who's available, I suppose. Yeah.
No, that's that's great
Question.
advice. Yeah, yes. As I say, we were very fortunate to find you. Thank you, Mary. Your time is precious, and we are ever so grateful that you've taken the time to spend with us today. And we do greatly appreciate your extensive knowledge and your experience and expertise, and for sharing your passion for nature play.
Thanks, Karen.
We will be emailing you the presentation tomorrow, so please share it with your services and your colleagues. It's a great team meeting presentation, and show it to your management. Show them what you want, and you know, this is a great way. You know, we do have to sell these things as educators of what you know is really important. So a great opportunity to show the people who are the holders of the budget, and some great examples there from Mary as well. So that we have one more session coming up for our early years series, which is next Thursday, the 8th of September. And where has that time gone as well? I just don't know. We're heading out of term 4 and into term 4. But you have a wonderful treat next week as well. Dr. Sue Elliott is recently retired as the Senior Lecturer in Early Childhood Education at University of England. And she is talking to us about, is sustainability just about being outdoors? Possibilities for early years and school outdoor play spaces. So, and this is so important, as these children are our next the generation of who will be dealing with climate change issues and sustainability and environmental issues. So she'll have a focus on education for sustainability, outdoor play spaces and nature play. So thank you again, Mary. Thank you to everyone for coming online and for being part of the series. We hope that you have enjoyed it, and we really look forward to seeing you for our final session on next Thursday, the 8th of September. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.